So I'm here to tell you a really incredible story, a story that few people in San Francisco know, even though it happened right here. How a gay priest founded America's first suicide hotline. So in 1960, San Francisco had the highest suicide rate in the United States, which isn't true anymore, many of whom were jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. It wasn't considered a crisis, but more of a curiosity. A local newspaper published a headline at the time that said, "Suicide? San Francisco couldn't care less." Yeah. And that wasn't they weren't canceled for that. So San Francisco wasn't alone, because suicide prevention, as we see it today, is a novel concept. Up until this period, most of the approaches to prevent suicide were more punitive rather than supportive. So the first act of suicide prevention, if you could call it that, was in 600 BC in Rome, near this place called Capitoline Hill. There was this place where criminals were thrown off a cliff in order to be punished. And there were also Roman soldiers at the time who were stationed in that area to do manual labor, which they found undignified and frankly really painful. So their quality of life was really low. They saw that people were being executed this way, and they chose to jump off this hill themselves instead. So the Roman Empire were like, we need these people to do labor. So instead of trying to improve their quality of life, lowering their workload, yeah, thank you for laughing at that. Improving quality of life is always the last option. So instead of improving their quality of life, they just went the punitive route. They said, how can we punish somebody who didn't fear death? So they said, we're going to shame them after they're dead, and we'll tell everybody, if we find your body at the bottom of this cliff, we're gonna crucify you in a public place, so that your family will know forever that you did something wrong. And this has been the approach for thousands of years after this. The Catholic Church also, at first, early on in Christianity, suicide was considered the act of a martyr. Somewhere along the line, when we recognized that people were needed to commit the labor for the upper class, they chose to change the narrative and say that people who killed themselves were sinners. And that was how they prevented suicide, by shaming those who are at risk. So it took another 2,000 years after this first act of suicide prevention in order to do something that was in some way trying to help the people who are at risk. So the Royal Humane Society was founded specifically to help people who were dying by suicide. And it was more of people trying to prevent the eternal damnation of their countrymen than trying to prevent their suffering. But anyone who prevented a suicide was paid 4 guineas. If they didn't prevent the suicide but tried, they get 2. And the way that they tried to do this was more like EMT skills. It was more about resuscitation. So the science wasn't quite there yet. This was the technique for resuscitating drowning victims. You take a pipe and you stick it right up the asshole, and you blow tobacco smoke as deep in as you can get. Supposedly it wakes them up. Yeah. We've improved our methods since then. Now we vape directly into the rectum. But so, it still wasn't really about emotional support, which is how we see suicide prevention today. And it was a long time before that was even considered an option. There were little groups here and there who tried to prevent suicide in different ways. But it wasn't until the 1950s that a different priest, not our underdog, we'll get to him in a second, Father Chad Vara founded something called the Samaritans. So he was a priest who he was working in his parish, and he had a young woman in his parish die by suicide, and it turned out the reason she killed herself was she started menstruating, and she thought there was something wrong with her. Yeah, so he became a major proponent for sex education. Yeah. And he also started putting advertisements out in papers saying, if you want support and you're thinking of ending things, just call me or come see me in my office. And so many people showed up that he started taking volunteers from his parish to serve cookies to the people who were waiting in his waiting room. And he found out that a lot of those people were already feeling better by the time they talked to him because they were talking to other members of the community. So he formed this service called the Samaritans. It was quasi-religious. It isn't anymore. It's still operating. It's still amazing. So this was one of the most successful opportunities for preventing suicides at the time, but it was still religious. On the other side of the world, in Los Angeles, there was another effort to try to prevent suicide, yeah. But this time through clinical psychologists. So these three gentlemen are Edwin Schneidman, Norman Farborough, and Robert Littman, who founded the Los Angeles Suicide Prevention Center in the 50s. And a lot of people say they founded the first suicide hotline. They didn't. So I really care about this fact. So they created a really cool service that was to help people who are at risk of suicide, which they founded this operation because Schneidman was a young psychologist who was doing research, and he ended up working for the Los Angeles coroner and was asked to write letters of condolence to the families of people who died by suicide. And he said, I don't really know what to write. And they said, well, just look in the closet full of all the suicide notes. And he was like, you have a closet full of suicide notes? So he went through it, and he's a researcher, so he went through these notes and he realized, like, this is really helpful information for understanding people who are suicidal and maybe how to help them. Yeah, so he actually did some science. Thank you, Edwin Schneidman. But they still had some of the limitations of clinical psychology, which we're gonna go into in a second. So introducing our underdog, this is Bernard Mays. This is extremely metal autobiography cover. So you can already get the sense of what he thinks of the church as a gay priest, escaping God's closet. So Bernard was born in 1929, and he's so cute there. And his perspective on the world was really colored by being in London right after World War I and right before World War II. He was just like obsessed with death. And he really liked reading philosophy and poetry, which is actually how he discovered he was gay. He found out what homosexuality was from Plato. And he was like, that's me. Yeah. And so he went away to boarding school, and when he was in boarding school, the headmaster of his school was gay. And everyone kind of knew, and it was like talked about behind the scenes, hush hush, and he really looked up to him. And then that headmaster killed himself. So this thought lingered in Bernard's mind that there are gay people out there like me, they're not accepted, and sometimes they're driven to suicide. So surprisingly, he wasn't discouraged from the church after this. In this time, Christianity was considered being the sort of source of the greatest truth about the human experience. So he instead went deeper and deeper into Christianity and decided to go to seminary to learn more about the meaning of existence. And when he was there, he was not very well accepted because he questioned everything. And they said, you need to humble yourself. So he decided he didn't want to be in England anymore. And he looked all over the world for a place where he can explore these questions and not be shamed for the things he's wondering about. Which brings us to another fantastic underdog, the Bishop James Pike. So James Pike was considered a heretic of his time because he had some insane notions. He wanted women to be ordinated. He wanted the racial desegregation of this church. Yeah, he even invited Martin Luther King to speak at Grace Cathedral after his march on Selma. And he also was promoting a living wage for workers and, unbelievably, the acceptance of LGBT people into the church. So Bernie was like, that's my dude. Okay, I am going to the Bay Area because that's where James Pike was the bishop. And he was really excited. He thought he was going to be in San Francisco, but he wasn't put in San Francisco. He was put into Marin. And the people of Marin did not like Bernard. They did not like Bernard very much because Bernard was weird. So he did some like side work for the BBC doing reporting, and he liked to report on the weirdest stuff he could find. And at the time, reporting on NASA was really, really weird. He was a rebel. Here's him at the Right to Sing riot in the 50s. So this is another really good Odd Salon talk. It was a riot about the right to sing folk songs in Washington Square Park. And then, he was out about the fact that he was gay. Like, he would tell people, I spent a lot of time at the YMCA. And People in this community did not care for that. He was sexually assaulted by one of the female members of his parish because she wanted to convert him. And this sort of behavior is really common. He's like, I don't like these people. I don't want to be around them. I want to be in the Tenderloin. And as do we all. So he spent a lot of time in the Tenderloin actually talking to the queer community there. And to him, it was really obvious why there were high suicide rates in San Francisco. All the gay people there were treated like shit. And of course they'd feel suicidal when they have no one to talk to. Because at the time, there were two potential sources of emotional support for people at risk of suicide. There was the Christian church, which we've covered a little bit, but just to remind you, the Bible does say you should not lie with mankind as with womankind. It's an abomination. So a lot of gay people weren't feeling comfortable with that. But then we have this other group that was just starting, which was clinical psychologists. And this is the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the first edition. And at that time, this guide that was used to diagnose mental health conditions said that homosexuality was a subset of sociopathic personality disorder. Yeah, bad science. And Bernard was like, why would anybody reach out to either of these places if they're feeling suicidal? And Bernard, the fact that he wanted inclusion of LGBT people was really exciting and really marvelous. But I think the thing that he realized that was groundbreaking was that shaming people for having a risk of suicide wasn't going to help. If you wanted to help people who are at risk of suicide, you need to understand that they think they're doing the right thing. If you spend all of someone's life telling them that you'd rather they be dead than gay, they're going to choose to die. And he said, you can't shame people. You have to accept what they're bringing you and listen to them, and that can give them help. So he said he wanted to form an organization to prevent suicide, and he said it was important that any service that I might devise not be known or perceived as either religious or medical. So going back to these clinical psychologists, in Bernard's autobiography, he doesn't reference them by name, he references them obliquely, but when he was trying to consult with them to form a non-clinical service, they were really rude to him, and they said, what you're trying to do is dangerous. Only clinical psychologists can help somebody at risk of suicide, and that's how their center operated. They only had clinical psychologists helping people, which meant there were fewer people that they could help, right? Because they had a smaller community of higher barrier services. They weren't available 24/7. You had to pay for their services. And it just wasn't actually accessible to everyone. So the more that he consulted with these folks, the more he realized this is important. I have to have a service to help suicidal people that isn't tied to the church and isn't tied to clinical psychology. So he looked everywhere for office space. And unlike the Los Angeles Center, he didn't have any funding. He just used the money in his pocket, and he went from door to door trying to find an office that was willing to take him for this project. And every time he told somebody what he wanted to do, they told him it was too dangerous, and they didn't want suicidal people to come there. And I mean, he said it was over the phone, but it didn't change their mind. They were like, no, this is weird and dangerous. No. Over and over again until he found this building. And he rang the door to try to respond to the for rent sign in this basement apartment. And the man came down and he tried to explain what the service was, and he tried to avoid saying it, but finally he said, yes, I want to form a service to help suicidal people. And the man nodded his head and he extended his arms, and there were long scars along each arm. And he said, help people like me, because he'd attempted suicide and survived. And he was the only person willing to give the space to provide this service. So Bernard was able to run his idea, and he got a bunch of volunteers, and he made it 24/7, and people started calling. He advertised the service by printing matchbooks that said, thinking of ending it all, call Bruce. He just wanted there to be a friendly name that seemed inviting to people. And they called. And within 2 years, the Los Angeles Suicide Hotline made an exact same service. Within 6 years, there were 4 other hotlines in the Bay Area. Now there are hundreds across the country. Yeah. So the DSM didn't remove homosexuality as a mental illness until 1974. And the Chicago Gay Crusader published a headline the next day that's great. 20 million gay people cured overnight. Bernard continued to fight for gay rights, which he called reconciliation between the church and gay people. He formed a foundation for Christian gay people to educate churchgoers on their beliefs that he called the Parsonage, and this is one of their events that they held at Grace Cathedral. So he remained a guide for San Francisco suicide prevention for many years, but did leave it officially in 1970. And he founded another service he thought would be really helpful, which is to tell people unbiased information about the media. So he went ahead and co-founded KQED. And he thought, this is a really great project. We should try to make it national. So he co-founded NPR. Yeah, this guy was a badass. So this is a story that's really meaningful to me. Bernard is one of my heroes because I knew him. I volunteered at the suicide hotline that he started back in 2011 when he was still alive. And, I remember he would constantly come by and bring the biggest box of See's chocolates I'd ever seen. I never saw them in the store. He just somehow made them and carried them to us. And I volunteered there, and then I worked there. I became the director eventually. And it was life-changing for me to realize that I could help people and that I could connect to people. And I'll never forget the last conversation I had with Bernard a month before he died. He asked me if I was still taking calls, which many people in my position didn't do, and I said I was. And he looked at me really gravely and he said, taking a call is the most important thing a person can do. And what he meant by that is that opening yourself up to supporting somebody who doesn't think they deserve to live it's a sacred act. And I'm so glad that he gave me the opportunity to do that. Yeah. If you would like to volunteer at a suicide hotline, they're all over the place, built on the model that Bernard created. There's crisis support services in Alameda. There's San Francisco Suicide Prevention, which is the line he founded, although it's now part of the Felton Institute, which is a great institution in San Francisco. Star Vista for San Mateo. And if you are a little too shy to talk on the phone, you can help out through crisis text line. And if you ever need someone to call, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is a suicide hotline routing service that will just, if you call that number, it will route you to whatever suicide hotline's closest to your area code, and they're going to change it to a short code in June, so it will be even easier to reach support. So I'd like to raise a glass to Bernard, who allowed it so that every underdog could get the support that they deserved. To Bernard.